Hello everyone and welcome to the last show of the week for the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. On today's show, we should have another exciting crop of player profiles, specifically on the Eastern Seaboard. We have NFC East mainly in terms of player profiles, but also we throw one AFC East guy in there because I think he can be a standout player and we don't want to exclude him. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you guys to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. Also, if you do feel so inclined, we do receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you would like to, leave them at the link gsmc.cloudoop. You get a little sneak preview of one of my segments. It is a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. If you also have any burning questions, comments, or concerns on any of my prior segments or any concerning this show, then you can leave them right here and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. So without further ado, let's jump right into the show. And let's start off in the world of the NFC East, the team that is slowly starting to build its defensive front, and this guy is a huge part of that rebuild. A guy who has cemented himself as one of the premier defensive tackles in not only the NFC East, but the entire NFL, and a guy who I really like in terms of IDP leagues, and that is Dexter Lawrence. When you think about the Giants' defense, though, Dexter Lawrence doesn't really come to mind as someone who can dominate the interior of an offensive line in terms of pass rush ability. You see, they added Kayvon. They already had Kayvon Thibodeau. They added Bobby Okereke at the linebacker position as well. And then they added Brian Burns off the edge. So there is now a wealth of talent surrounding Dexter Lawrence at the defensive tackle position, but I still believe that there is merit to what he does and how he goes about redefining the defensive tackle position, because he puts up good production stats as well, and that's something to keep in mind as you look at this Giants defensive front, because as it adds more pieces, Dexter Lawrence still will remain the most important piece, due to the fact that he is not only just opening up lanes for others, but he himself can stop the run, can get some tackles, and can also get to the quarterback as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into the stats that define Dexter Lawrence in terms of fantasy. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 395.9 fantasy points. His best season was in 2022, when he got 115.5 fantasy points. Last year was a solid year for him. 32 solo tackles, 7 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, 21 QB hits, and he's looking to really have a career-defining season now with the talent that he wants surrounding him. And he can focus more on, developing as a defensive tackle, because over the past couple of years, even before Kayvon Thibodeau, Dexter Lawrence was a young, inexperienced guy who kind of forced his way into this Giants front. He's shown he's sharp at the position, he's shown his intelligence, he's shown his development, and he's shown the skill and strength it requires to hold down a defensive tackle spot in the NFL. And when I look at other defensive tackles, there may be bigger ones, maybe stronger ones, there may be faster ones. But I think that Dexter Lawrence, now especially, is one who's going to grow and develop due to him now having a support system that he can rely upon to help him get focused more on opening up space for them. Because right now, where I see him, he is kind of more of a pass rusher, so to speak. He can get to the quarterback. He can get tackles for loss. And while that's all good for, being a significant part, I don't think he's going to be the significant part anymore, because there's now 4 or 5 guys above him who can be seen as guys who will get more production than him. And we're going to talk about Kayvon Thibodeau a little bit later in the show. And he is someone who's definitely going to see a lot more action, a lot more blitzes from that linebacker position, a lot more opportunities for him to get going. And so where that puts Dexter Lawrence is in a really weird spot where he's kind of going to have to realize that the many ways he can benefit this team lay not just in, getting the tackles for loss and penetrating into the backfield, but it's for allowing better players to get their opportunities, because Brian Burns is an incredible asset to that defensive front. It now alleviates some of the pressure Dexter Lawrence has in occupying the guards that he's responsible for, and Brian Burns can just create for himself, and then all Dexter Lawrence needs to do is say, I'm going to occupy the guards and centers in front of me and allow for guys like Thibodeau and Okirike to then come down from the linebacker position to blitz as well. Because in this 3-4 system, I think the Giants are really going to focus a lot on individual pressures coming from players like Burns and Okirike. That's why they got a guy like Brian Burns. I think he really fits this 3-4 defense well, and he really complements what Dexter Lawrence can do in terms of, plugging the run more. Because I think when I consider the Giants' linebacker core, which I believe is the best aspect of their defense, they're very blitz-heavy guys. I think that Kayvon Thibodeau always likes to rush the passer. He's always going to be more comfortable in terms of tackling, in terms of sideline-to-sideline lateral movement, and ultimately getting to the ball. And I think Bobby Okirike also kind of fits that mold, but he's still solid in coverage. I like Bobby Okirike because he forces turnovers. I like him because he's an agile linebacker, and I like him because Kayvon Thibodeau can sim pressures, and they can kind of switch between which one of them is on the blitz. And so, I look at the makeup of the Giants' defense and how Dexter Lawrence fits within it. I'm really liking Dexter Lawrence as the guy to stack blockers, maybe get in the run game, and ultimately develop more as a prototypical defensive tackle instead of a guy who can contribute in the pass rush. Because at the current moment, as it stands, when I think of premier Giants pass rushers, before it was Kayvon Thibodeau, then Dexter Lawrence. Now it's Kayvon Thibodeau, Brian Burns, Bobby Okirike, and Dexter Lawrence. So how the Giants are going to develop Dexter Lawrence is going to be integral to his stats he's going to put up. But in terms of fantasy, in terms of IDP especially, when you're looking at defensive tackles, it's very hard to find one who already has the intelligence and experience and know-how to combine their ability to stack and then also understand what it means to be a pass rusher as well. And Dexter Lawrence primarily fits that mold because he came into a Giants defense that was still rebuilding, retooling. Before Kayvon Thibodeau came, before they really started to get serious and make good acquisitions, much like they did with Brian Burns and Okirike. So Dexter Lawrence understands what it means to be in a defense that isn't fully molded. And so, while there are definitely a lot of factors that can factor into perhaps him not producing as much as you want him to, he still is so talented because of what he had to go through before to get to the point where he is now. And so, in this system, he may not be the prettiest option in terms of stat line, especially this season. But also, he has the benefit of having been here for a while, one of the longest tenured Giants defenders. And he also has the benefit of knowing the system. Ryan Burns and Bobby Okereke will have to work their way into the system. And so they might get off to slower starts, and that opens the door for Dexter Lawrence to pad his stats earlier in the season. And also, since the Giants play a 3-4, there's a lot more lenience to how Dexter Lawrence plays. Because in a 3-4, a lot of your pass rush is derivative of your linebackers as well. As we can see, Kayvon Thibodeau later, his stats can be seen as more of an edge rusher. So the way the Giants play their 3-4 truly makes Dexter Lawrence someone you have to keep your eye on and can catch your attention. And that's really to his benefit in a system that, while is certainly the best it's been, can certainly start to find its footing later in the season and will truly help Dexter Lawrence in terms of getting him to understand the role while also maintaining his dominance as potentially a pass rushing force. And that duality is what makes me consider him as one of the best defensive tackles to go out and get in an IDP draft. That will just about do it for this segment. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Dexter Lawrence is definitely someone you should think about. Coming next, we go to one of the established veterans of the NFC East at the corner position in kind of a transitional period for this Eagles secondary. We are going to talk a little bit more about Darius Slay when we come back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed the first segment. Our second segment should be just as good. Before we get into it, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Also remember that you can leave questions, comments, or concerns about the show at the link as well, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of the day with a guy who definitely is one of the most experienced defenders in the NFC East, and definitely one of the most experienced defenders in a secondary that is trying to rebuild, but kind of stuck in this weird stasis where you have these guys who are young, but then you also have this veteran guy who might still have something to say about that corner competition, and that is Darius Slay. The Eagles' secondary has always been one of their points of contention, no matter if it has been stellar or a little bit underwhelming. And what I mean by that is the constant additions, the constant kind of development of different storylines surrounding this secondary due to its myriad number of players leads me to consider Darius Slay as someone who might not be highly coveted, but B, still can add value not just as a veteran, but because of his intelligence in the system. He's been around the league. He knows what it takes to be a premier corner. And now, it was likely to be his final stop, even though he's been talking about potentially, if not having a good season with the Eagles, going to another team, it potentially could be his final stop. There's a lot to learn here for Darius Slay as this secondary gets kind of a younger breath of fresh air feel to it. And so, even though I really like him still, he's an interesting fantasy option in terms of IDP to peruse, but there definitely are more caveats now than bright spots to Darius Slay. But let's look over his fantasy career, and you can make of it what you will. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 812.7 fantasy points. His best season was actually in Detroit when he had 111 fantasy points in 2017. Last year, there were some bright spots in terms of stats, but there were some lowlights. 48 total tackles, but only 1 tackle for loss. 15 passes defended still and 2 interceptions. And so, when I look at the Darius Slay, and I look at his expertise at the corner position, his understanding of certain systems that younger corners might not be able to understand, I still see some value that's not just sentiment and not just, because it's Darius Slay. I still see the fact that he is someone who can step into a system, can learn from what he sees in the secondary to develop himself and have it translate onto the field. And at the end of the day, he is still a fantastic cover man. My only concern is that in certain situations, he might need more range than he currently has. And since he's slowing down in terms of, what he's able to do, and certain abilities and certain agilities that are required of him, I think that maybe, it's a little bit safer to shy away from him. And to top it all off, he did have that back injury in their wild card game against the Bucs. So there are some concerns with an aging corner in a secondary that is kind of looking to move past him a little bit. So let's talk about this secondary, though, because I still see some silver linings to him potentially having a huge workload in this season, and it should be one of his final seasons. So the Eagles' approach to their secondary is much like their approach to all of the other defense positions. Kind of approach it through youth and through development. Darius Slay, if you've noted, has been one of the only constants from kind of their trade situations where they acquired certain secondary pieces. Gone is Garner Johnson. Gone are some other people. And now you're looking at a room where, outside of Darius Slay, the only really experienced person in that secondary outside of him is Reed Blankenship. And then you bring in guys like Quinion Mitchell, who definitely is going to be one of their more rangy, long, versatile corners. And then you bring in Cooper DeJean, who can definitely play many different parts in this defense. And you say to yourself, well, if I'm Darius Slay, what does this mean for how I integrate myself into this defense? Because I'm still here. And even though my role might be lightened a little bit, I still have a responsibility. I still have a workload, no matter how desperate my situation looks. Because yes, these young kids, they can play many parts in the system, but they still don't know the intricacies of this defense. And that's to my advantage. So Darius Slay has to waste his options, because right now he's in a very pivotal spot right here. Because the Eagles secondary has been, throughout his tenure there, heavily scrutinized, heavily criticized, much maligned as for an area of need for the Eagles. And ultimately, Darius Slay has been at the center of those discussions for many years to come. Now, in 2024 and 25, the Eagles are starting to realize that, hey, our secondary might need a more youthful look. We're going to go out and get Mitchell through the draft and Dejean through the draft. And so, Darius Slay now has a decision to make. He can either accept that his workload might be lightened, or he can step into the role of leader and lead by example on the field. He may not be the guy who is Quinion Mitchell. He may not be the guy who is versatile in Cooper DeJean, but he still is someone who has the NFL experience, is willing to play, and most importantly, is a vocal leader for a secondary in transition. And eventually, sooner rather than later, Darius Slay is going to be either out of the league or on a different team. And so, in what could be his final season in Philly, this is his opportunity to say, I'm still elite, maybe not as elite as before, and I'm also a vocal leader for a younger group of players in my secondary. Now here's where kind of workload comes into play. Say the Eagles see Cooper DeJean is more of a linebacker hybrid player, and they want him to be the energetic guy who's active in the blitz, can drop into coverage, can play sideline to sideline. That benefits, Darius Slay, because it takes away competition for one of those corner spots, and it's ultimately up to him, Blankenship, and Quinion Mitchell. Now, if you look at Blankenship, he is still very young. He does have experience in the secondary, but does he have enough to warrant important snaps on different downs? Does it warrant being out there in more difficult situations where it could require A, intelligence, and B, speed, which now leaves Slay and Mitchell, which I actually think is the perfect cornerback pairing for this Eagles secondary. If you think about it, Quinion Mitchell makes up for a lot of deficiencies in speed that Darius Slay might have. And Darius Slay is still the perfect cover man. Whether the Eagles play man or zone, Darius Slay's intelligence and ability to diagnose different coverages and different routes makes him an asset. And pairing him with Quinion Mitchell makes the speed factor a little bit more intriguing, because when you add intelligence and speed together, you get two players who A, can make tackles, and B, can create positive plays for the defense, like pass breakups and interceptions. So Darius Slay, in terms of IDP, still has merit, because as a coverage guy, he's going to be the guy who sees a lot of balls thrown his way, and maybe to, make up for what he lacks in speed, he's going to be someone who people can think, hey, I can get away with throwing to Darius Slay. but that could also benefit his stat-wise, and that's why I think he's still an intriguing option IDP. Not just because of his experience, but because of how he's developed as a player in this league, and because of how his deficiencies can play into his strengths a little bit here, and the strengths of other players in the secondary. And so, while Darius Slay may be slowing down, and this could be his last year in the league, and he could not be an Eagle either, he could move to a different team. He still is valuable in terms of his presence, in terms of what he brings, in terms of diagnosing routes, and most importantly, the fact that he has a chance to be a vocal leader for the secondary. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming up, we switch from the Eagles to the Patriots. We have a couple AFC East guys coming up. What does Matthew Judon's season look like for the Patriots as one of their best defenders? We will be right back to discuss him on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are now transitioning from the NFC to the AFC East. We do want to include some AFC East guys, and this guy that I'm going to be talking about right now is someone who is flying under the radar on a Patriots defense that's kind of a little bit scatterbrained and doesn't really have many pieces to build around. But this guy has always been a constant, and I think that with the new head coach Jerod Mayo being a solid presence in terms of what he adds to the defensive game plan, I really think this guy is going to have a very explosive year. And we are, of course, talking about Matthew Judon. I really think it benefits Judon to have a guy like Jerod Mayo, one of the best Patriots linebackers of the recent years, having him as a head coach, because in a system where he's kind of the central power in this defense, he really needs someone who can create a culture that allows him to develop other guys around him, because as I see it right now, Matthew Judon is the guy for the Patriots because they don't have much depth up front in their front three. Their secondary, they have some guys like Duggar, who I like, but not really one who catches your attention. So Matthew Judon has a lot of weight to carry in this defensive front. And so what I look for out of him is kind of this hybrid linebacker pass rushing role where he's kind of manning different spots. I know he's not the middle linebacker. In fact, he's the weak side linebacker, which requires him to be just as athletic and agile as, say, a defensive end. But I really think that Matthew Judon is a nice little chess piece to what the Patriots can do defensively. I think Jerod Mayo is going to diagnose that we might have to lean on our linebacker core a little in order to generate pressure. And in terms of Matthew Judon, he's a fantastic asset, but there are some caveats. But without further ado, let's jump right into the stats that pop off the page for Matthew Judon. Now, as a career, he's accumulated 806 fantasy points. His best season was in 2022 with 143.2. He had 10 solo tackles last year, 5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, 9 QB hits. Ultimately, this was an injury-racked season. He underwent bicep surgery over the offseason, and he is kind of getting older in age in terms of he's 31 years old. He's entering his age 32 season. But if it makes it any better, in 2022, he did have his best season, 60 tackles, 15.5 sacks. So as you can see, when needed and if fully fit, Matthew Judon certainly is one of the premier linebackers and plays like an edge rusher at that position. So when I look at the Patriots linebacking core, it's definitely a thin position group. You have Jawan Bentley, Jelani Tavai as your two other linebackers, and when you look at their front, you have a guy in Christian Barmore who I think can develop a little bit more. I still think he hasn't reached his ceiling just yet. And so I think that what you're going to have to build on if you're Gerard Mayo and if you're the defensive coordinator of the Patriots is understanding that the generation of pressure in this system does not necessarily have to all be on, Matthew Judon. It can come from his movement as well. And especially coming off a big surgery, as you're getting older, especially, it can be to your benefit to help your team in terms of your moving abilities. You don't necessarily have to get to the quarterback. You don't necessarily have to get tackles for loss. You can be a linebacker in terms of sideline to sideline strength. I don't think there's anyone better than Matthew Judon in the league. Not many better, because there are better linebackers that I believe. But there's not many better sideline to sideline players and guys who can operate in many different roles than Matthew Judon. And that versatility can come in handy. Because say Gerard Mayo may not trust him to have a heavy workload. Maybe he does want to see more out of Bentley and Tavai at the linebacker positions. He can rest Matthew Judon a little bit, get him in on later downs, and then, be able to mix his coverages. Because if I'm Matthew Judon right now, I'm saying, hey, 2 years ago I had my best season, my career year. Last season, I got hurt. And so, what can I do to benefit the team while also protecting myself? I know Gerard Mayo definitely wants to implement me. Me and him will probably have a great relationship. But in order to preserve myself, I can be kind of the gadget guy now. And that can really lead to benefit in terms of IDP, because in late downs, that's where linebackers get most of their stats. That's where a lot of linebacker production comes from, because that's where you send pressure. And Matthew Judon, like I said before, he's the ultimate pressure linebacker. His movement alone, his presence alone, is like that of an extra defensive end. And so I'm really intrigued as to how he's going to want to fit into the system if he sees himself as fully fit. Because I think what's going to matter for the Patriots right now is just identifying a defensive identity. You don't necessarily have to see it come to fruition this season, but identifying what you want to build around and how you want to build around it is going to be highly integral to how this team looks in the long run. They know they're not going to have that great of an offense. They know that Drake May is going to have to take a while to get adjusted to the league, just dipping his feet into the water. And I think their defense is going to see a lot of snaps this year. And it's definitely going to be a very sink-or-swim mentality there. And so, what I want to see, if I'm a Patriots fan, from my defense is a buy-in to an idea, a philosophy. Because what really created this rift in the Belichick era was that Belichick couldn't identify with this more younger group. He made a lot of poor decisions with how this defense was built, with how this defense played, and it really is leading to the detriment of this defense as they head into the season, because I think that Jerod Mayo will have a decent season. I think in terms of his coaching style, in terms of what he wants out of his team, I think he's setting good foundations. But it's going to be very difficult to see it translate to the field, especially early on, if you know there are lingering concerns about how these players' mindsets were affected by the Belichick era. It's going to be a little while before they truly buy into Jerod Mayo's mindset. There are going to be some speed bumps along the way. This is going to be a very, very rocky season for the Patriots. There's not going to be many wins to come by, and it's going to be very frustrating on both sides of the football. But you do need a significant change in culture, maybe in the latter stages of the season, in order for me to truly say that anyone outside of Matthew Judon could have an impact. I like some pieces around Matthew Judon, but this season is going to be very pivotal for Matthew Judon. And if he's not fully healthy, then the walls will come crashing down for the New England Patriots on the defensive side of the football. And certainly there has to be concern about his longevity as well, because I think his style of play certainly tends to a shorter career, because when you're someone in a defense that completely relies around your abilities, and you just suffered one of your first injuries, you underwent surgery, you're getting older in age, and you have a new head coach, and these players are not fully developing, it kind of gets frustrating, and it kind of is one of those moments where you have to consider, hey, how long can I be doing this? So there are a lot of concerns surrounding Matthew Judon, and it's too Judon-centric for me to fully have confidence in him kind of being able to take it easy while still getting the stats that we know he can put up. And so this season is going to be a career-defining season for not just Matthew Judon, but for everyone on that defense. Matthew Judon, no matter what part he plays in it, is going to be heavily scrutinized this year. He's going to be especially scrutinized for how he helps this team and this unit. And so, while I truly want to say, in terms of IDP, there's no one like Matthew Judon, and I think he wears so many hats that you can't help but pick him, there are a lot of caveats here. And I really think that you have to be mindful of a guy like Matthew Judon, because we don't know how long he's going to continue playing. We don't know if more injuries will spike up throughout this season. However, nevertheless, he does have someone at the head coaching position who I think he can really find trust in, and that reciprocity is going to translate to the field, because Matthew Judon, at the end of the day, is the best defensive weapon in New England Patriots' arsenal. He's going to be deployed in so many different ways as long as he's on the football field, and that's the main reason why I can't necessarily look past him, and the main reason why the Patriots' defense will find some modicum of consistency as the season goes on. They have to find a culture, and Matthew Judon is the guy, combined with Jerod Mayo's mind and his defensive game plans, to really see it translate. Maybe in this season, but into next season as well. But coming next, I hope you enjoyed this segment. Coming up next, we have another AFC East linebacker. This guy definitely going to have a lot more responsibility, a guy who's definitely going to vault into the stratosphere as well. We're going to be back with the fantasy player profile of Matt Milano on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of the show and we have our final AFC East Defensive Player of the Day in terms of IDP player profiles. And this guy I really like. He isn't necessarily overlooked, more so undervalued. And I say this because in this defense, a lot more position groups are getting better around him, and he is going to have to remain the constant in this Buffalo Bills defense, and that player is, of course, Matt Milano. I really believe that this Buffalo Bills defense is kind of glossing over the linebacker position, mainly because Matt Milano is so central to that position group, and Von Miller is kind of aging out of that position group, that I think they're pretty happy with just allowing Matt Milano to dictate whatever the linebacker group becomes. And his flexibility truly is an asset to what the Buffalo Bills want out of this defense, because this defense definitely is very sneaky, and Matt Milano is one of the main reasons why. And so without further ado, let's jump right into what makes Matt Milano such a special player and someone who you can't undervalue any longer. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 644.8 fantasy points. His best season was in 2022, where he had 140.7 fantasy points. Last season, pretty solid season, up and down. A couple injuries beset him throughout his season. 18 solo tackles, 1 tackle for loss, 2 passes defended, 2 interceptions, 1 QB hit. So as you can see, not as consistent as years prior, but hey, injuries happen to the best of them. And he's still in that weird part of his career where he's entering the end of his prime years, but he still has some within him. And so when I look at Matt Milano, and I look at the makeup of the Bills linebacker room, it's a bunch of guys who, outside of him and Von Miller, who himself is getting older and might not have years in him, are really developmental guys who I really think aren't bad players, but really add to how valuable Matt Milano is at this position, because it allows him to be very flexible. If you just have guys who are sideline to sideline, can get tackles, then Matt Milano can operate in so many different ways. And when I consider the fact that the Buffalo Bills defensive front, say the defensive three, are really starting to develop into their own, I really like Ed Oliver at the D tackle position. I like what he brings in terms of physicality. I really like Greg Russo and how he's going to develop. I really like AJ Epinesa as well. They're kind of entering the prime of their careers. They're going to have breakout years. And I look at the back end. Christian Benford and Rasul Douglas are 2 young guys in the secondary who really are kind of underestimated. I think they're one of the best kind of corner groups in this entire NFL. You add a guy in Cole Bishop who I really like, Damar Hamlin, as obviously he's getting back to being incorporated into that group as well. And I really like the front and back of this Buffalo Bills defense. And when I look at the middle, it's a bunch of guys who are really focused on allowing Matt Milano to operate. Because even though you have guys in the front, you have guys like Oliver, you have guys like Ebenezer, and you have guys in the back like Ben Ford and Rasul Douglas, the main focus of the defense is what Matt Milano does. I think that obviously as he's kind of exiting his prime years, you have to kind of be concerned about his, physicality levels, his injury concerns, his, all-around style of play, because Matt Milano is a very physical player. Make no ands, ifs, or buts about it. He's always going to be in and around every single defensive play that the Bills run. And so, what I really want to see out of Matt Milano this season is not just him taking a back seat, but realizing that he can still be the central force, but he also needs to understand that the Buffalo Bills are now built to sustain pressure. They're built to, at every level of the defense, cover for him. Ed Oliver and AJ Epenesa can get pressure. Christian Benford and Rasul Douglas can cover their men. So, I really think that Matt Milano's going to need to understand that, hey, I can still be myself. I can still be the Matt Milano everybody knows and loves. But I also need to understand that this team is not necessarily going to be relying on me as much. And so, when I look at the roles that he plays, he's so good at guarding the screen game. He's so good at run stopping, blitzing. He wears so many hats. And I look at the ways that the Buffalo Bills can really help him out. I think that if you kind of limit Matt Milano's pressures and when he decides to blitz, I still think he's going to be one of the better linebackers in the league. Because I look at the leg injury after 5 games last season, and it was a really, really gruesome leg injury. I'm thinking about preserving the best of Matt Milano and not risking the worst, if that makes sense. He can go sideline to sideline. He can defend the pass very well. But let's not risk him in certain blitzing situations when we know that our guys up front can do the job there. We know that our corners can come up in coverage, can really jam receivers. So why risk Matt Milano when we know that he can still be impactful? In terms of IDP, I don't expect his stats to go down, and that's reflective of what I'm saying. If they incorporate all the elements of this defense to help Matt Milano alleviate some of the pressure he's putting on himself, then Matt Milano won't be forced to have to be the everyman for this defense. And it also is very reflective of this linebacker core because your best 2 guys are kind of up there in age. Matt Milano is entering his age 30 season. He still might have some prime years in him, but Von Miller is 35. He can't always play at the position. So you have to understand that, hey, we need to start finding guys who can also mitigate for the deficiencies that might befall Matt Milano in his future. So you have guys like Terrell Bernard, still in his prime. You have guys like Ulofoshio. You have guys like Balin Spector. And you got a guy actually from my high school in Shane Simon as an undrafted free agent to come into your team. And so if these guys focus more on, being active in pressures, if they become guys who are more active in defending certain passing plays, then Matt Milano's main concern will be just tackling, just finding ways into the backfield when he can, and overall preserving himself. Because pretty soon Von Miller's going to leave the league. And I don't think he's going to be an asset this year. So now's the time to start trying different things at the linebacker position surrounding Matt Milano to make sure that at the end of the day, the Bills linebacker group is not going to be the one who's bringing them down. And I like the fact that they're trying to find guys in their prime to make sure that they, if they get injured, don't necessarily end up, hurting them in the long run. Because if Matt Milano's injured, then you're really looking at a group that's kind of uncomfortable determining what they're going to do in certain aspects. And so, the ultimate goal for the Buffalo Bills has to be preserving the best years of Matt Milano, because they're slowly running out. And eventually, Matt Milano's production will go down to the point where he's not a good IDP player. But as of right now, I still think Matt Milano has a role to play as a linebacker in the Buffalo Bills defense. But that should just about do it for this segment. We are transitioning back to the NFC East, talking about a teammate of Dexter Lawrence's who is definitely primed for another big year. A guy who now has the partners he needs in crime to really focus on developing himself as a player. And this should be quite a good segment to finish out today's show and the week. We'll be right back to discuss whoever that is after the break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of today's show and of the week on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I really hope you guys enjoy this show, especially if you're fans of teams in the tri-state area. I really think the NFC and AFC East have highly underrated defenders that can really help you in IDP leagues. And this guy, I'm going to close the show out with, is no different. I think that when I look at the profile of the Giants defense, this guy is primed to be one of the faces of it for years to come, no matter who rotates in and out of their defensive system. So without further ado, let's look at the fantasy player profile of Kayvon Thibodeaux. Now, Thibodeaux is going to be one of those guys who, no matter what, is a plug-and-play player for the New York Giants because of his abilities to play much like a Matthew Judon type, kind of as a defensive end. His size and strength alone makes him one of the more intriguing young linebackers in the league to focus on. So without further ado, let's jump into why Kayvon Thibodeaux's star is going to ascend for years to come and why he's going to be so valuable no matter what. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 208.7 fantasy points. Last year was his best year with 114.3. 26 solo tackles last year, 12 tackles for loss, 12 sacks, 4 passes defended, and 3 forced fumbles. So as you can see, anywhere and everywhere he was needed last year, he was one of the Giants' everymen. And this year is going to be no different. Like I talked about when we talked about Dexter Lawrence. The Giants obviously made some shrewd moves, shrewd decisions in the front office to bring in guys that can help this defense. They brought in Burns, they brought in Okirike. And what I like about those additions is that they don't necessarily hinder the development of Kayvon Thibodeau, but they enhance it. And some Giants fans might be a little skeptical and wary of me saying this because they believe that Brian Burns and Bobby Okirike are going to be the stars. But you have to understand, when you are so ingrained into a system, when you come into a system and immediately play like Kayvon Thibodeau has, that just goes to show that the Giants are going to invest a lot of time in not just developing you, but building around you. That means they saw something in Kayvon Thibodeau as to where, hey, we can make this defense even more dangerous surrounding our pieces that we already have. Why not add to what Dexter Lawrence and Kayvon Thibodeau brings? If we add guys like Brian Burns and Bobby Okirike, we could be getting into defensive backfields in just a snap of the fingers like that. And so I think this is more looking at the advantages the Giants saw in the market in terms of who they could pick up, instead of, saying, hey, Dexter Lawrence and Kayvon Thibodeau, we are kind of looking at a very thin group outside of them. This is opportunity the Giants saw. And that's why I'm still so hyped to see Kayvon Thibodeau this year, while with new partners in crime at respective positions. And so I still think all the aspects that make Kayvon Thibodeau such a special linebacker will ring true here. Because looking at Bobby Okirike, he certainly is very strong. He certainly brings size and length. But I think that at the end of the day, he's going to be a coverage man. He's going to be a sideline-to-sideline player. Kayvon Thibodeau is where a lot of the pass rush from the linebacker group is going to come from. And now that you have Brian Burns and his agility and his power getting into the backfield, and Dexter Lawrence is stacking blockers, Kayvon Thibodeau has a lot of room to operate now. I think that, yes, Brian Burns is going to get some of his sacks. He's not going to have as many, perhaps, but he's still going to get in the backfield because of the penetration this Giants defensive front is going to bring. And so everything is starting to come up aces for not just the Giants defense, but Kayvon Thibodeau in particular. Now, here's the caveats. When you add someone like Bobby Okirike to your linebacker group, it certainly adds a level of intrigue to how the Giants will go about finding this understanding of when to bring pressure with that group. Because Bobby Okirike certainly can as well. He's not just going to sit back in coverage and make tackles sideline to sideline. I think the Giants are going to be an aggressive defense. Like I said before, they didn't just bring in Brian Burns and Bobby Okirike because they could. They brought them in for opportunity. And these guys are premier pass rushers who are going to, by hook or by crook, get to the quarterback in whatever way they can. And so I'm looking kind of at late downs and situational times where the Giants are going to send a lot of people. And that's where I think a lot of Kayvon Thibodeau's value could be lost. Because if you were deciding to send the house at the quarterback on later downs, that's where a lot of different situations can happen. Because a lot of different players will be in and around the ball, and a lot of different players will still have to carry out certain roles. So, let's say it's a third and short situation, so you want to bring some pressure. How do you handle that? Do you think that Brian Burns can hit the edge hard enough? Do you think that Dexter Lawrence can penetrate for long enough stack blockers to create opportunities for Kayvon Thibodeau and Okirike? And that's going to be the situation that the Giants look at and say, okay, we can have situations where if we're bringing pressure, one guy can go up and one guy can sit back. And eventually, they're going to have to live with one of those guys being Kayvon Thibodeau. Not to say that Kayvon Thibodeau is a terrible coverage man, because he can certainly grow and develop in that area now that Okirike is there, and some of those pressures are alleviated. But Kayvon Thibodeau's value certainly is going to stem from rushing the passer. And so, in those late down situations, when the Giants are like, hey, we smell blood, we're going to send the house, who is primarily going to get those production numbers and those stats is going to largely stem from how it's created. Because Brian Burns definitely can hit the edge hard, and Dexter Lawrence can open up lanes very quickly. And so, the utmost goal for the Giants is building off of the understanding that's already in place between Lawrence and Thibodeau, and then incorporating Brian Burns and Bobby Okirike to understand what part they play, because the prospects for this Giants defense is high. I really think that at the end of the day, this defense is going to be a force to be reckoned with. But they're going to have to pick and choose their moments. I always say this about defensive players, especially in terms of IDP, because when you're starting to build a defense that has a lot of different moving pieces, it all stems down to the factors that allow these pieces to have their moments. And this Giants defense right now is just full of not only moments, but opportunities for each and every player. For Burns to create pressure off the edge that they haven't really had in quite some time. For Lawrence to continue penetrating into the backfield with sheer force and will. And for the two linebackers, Okirike and Thibodeau, to really start to understand how to play different roles, to wear many different hats at the linebacker position. And so it's going to be a double-edged sword here, where a lot of balance has to come into play. A lot of situational football is going to have to be meted out. And so, at the end of the day, Kayvon Thibodeau will still be Kayvon Thibodeau, in my humble opinion. I still think that these moves are opportunities for him to get better, for him to realize the depth in himself and the intelligence he can bring to this Giants unit for years to come. But I also think he needs to see that the linebacker position is one of those positions where you're not always going to be the center of attention. And he definitely isn't anymore. And so, if the Giants really are going to be as aggressive as I think they are, the understanding has to stem from the practice of it, the repetition of it, the understanding that over and over again, different situations are going to be different. There are going to be moments where you're going to want to have pressure coming from so many different angles because you want to get home quick. You want to end games. You're in late games. You're down. You want to get the ball back. There's going to be moments like that. And for each of these players, especially Kayvon Thibodeau, because he's one of the youngest in this core, he's going to have to realize, hey, there are moments where I'm going to shine, and there are moments where, different scenarios will play out. But as a young player in this Giants offense, in this Giants defense, just always know that Kayvon Thibodeau is an option at IDP, just because of what he brings to this defense. It's just going to look a little bit different. That's just about do it for this show and this week of shows on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. It's a huge support to everyone involved. Leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated by all. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning to this week of shows on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys will join me next week when we will be back better than ever. Thank you guys yet again.